going to school was fine, but I wasn't very popular. So I was at like we used to call it the reject table, because like you had the football group, and then you had like the weird kids, and then you had those who ran cross country, and then we were on the other table.
Okay. Welcome everyone to another episode of the Alongside Podcast, which is a production of Heritage Baptist Church. The purpose of this podcast is to come alongside followers of Christ in order to have thoughtful conversations about the gospel, culture, and the church. I'm your host, Mike Crump, and today's episode is a very special back-to-school edition of Alongside, featuring a lively discussion about life as a student, both in the past and present. As a warning, you may hear a lot of back in my day on this episode, just for those who are listening, but I promise it doesn't end there. To help me in this old school endeavor, I want to welcome a table full of guests, including Pastor Kent, Pastor Nathan Fox, Joshua Hankins, and for his first time on the podcast, Matt Case is here. Very excited about having you on, Matt. The other guys are pretty cool too.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Guys, thank you so much for being here. I'm looking forward to this discussion. It should be a lot of fun and hopefully instructive. As I alluded to in the intro, the purpose of this conversation is kind of twofold. First, to encourage listeners by testifying of God's faithfulness through our lives so that maybe they can be encouraged in their own. And also to equip listeners and specifically maybe students and parents by providing insight and principles that can help prepare them for the new school year. Obviously, school is a little bit different than it was when we were in school.
Back in our day.
Back in our day. Thank you for that, Nathan. I appreciate it. But I think it's worthy of just kind of thinking through this. So our first question is, as we begin the discussion, what was your high school experience like back in your day? So I don't know who wants to go first on this one. Maybe Kent, because he's the oldest. I mean, is that how this works?
Well, there wasn't much to it in the one-room schoolhouse on the prairie. My high school experience, it was challenging. It was, we moved states at the start of my sophomore year and actually showed up 2 weeks late to my to public school there. There we moved, and my parents, we became missionaries with Word of Life Fellowship, area missionaries. So went from a small Christian school, felt very comfortable, et cetera, et cetera. Been there a few years, to public school setting. It was a small public school, but at the same time, then I'm like, oh man, I'm the missionary kid. I'm new to this. I'm struggling with all sorts of self-image issues at that time going into that. So it was very challenging. That first, I'll say 6 months or so. Yeah. And but overall, if I'd say my high school experience overall, it was positive. But then as I look back, and there was also much regret from a spiritual standpoint. Yeah. My idols, or excuse me, the gods that I made were idols of this world of even popularity, sports, approval. That would summarize, I think, my high school years versus living to honor the Lord. Yeah.
And we're going to get into some of those things because I think there is some similarity. I think that even today people deal with, but I think it's very helpful to and instructive to look back and see what those struggles were. What about you, Matt? What was high school like for you, or middle school, high school? We're kind of talking in that area.
Yeah, I went to LCA, which is just down the road from where we are. But back in my day, it was actually called Lynchburg Christian Academy, not Liberty Christian Academy. So even the school that's there now, it's not the school I went to. I went to the one that was at the old Thomas Road, not the one that's new there. My senior year was in the new building, but back in I guess that's what I have to say. I have to start saying that now. Now that I'm old and have kids, I have a day that I can refer back to.
You cross that threshold. You're there.
But so I went to it was a small Christian school because it wasn't even as big as it was now. We had, it was pretty small, but it I struggled with depression a lot through high school. Yeah. You can ask Pastor Kent. We had many talks. Pastor Kent was my youth pastor back then. And so it was challenging because I always had some dark thoughts here and there, and that made things. I had a good group of friends, so like going to school was fine, but I wasn't very popular. So I was at like we used to call it the reject table, because like you had the football group, and then you had like the weird kids, and then you had those who ran cross country, and then we were on the other table.
Gotcha. I was going to ask kind of what group did you associate with? I think I was in maybe not the reject, but the reject. I think I understand that.
Well, let me just say, Star Wars wasn't as cool as it is now. Back in my day, but
you kept dressing up every day as Chewbacca, which I think was a problem. But that aside,
but Christian school, I did have a lot of fun there, but it was pretty much marred with kind of depression and trying to. As a lot of high schools, trying to find myself because I didn't know where I fit in. I was switching between sports and acting, and so it was an interesting experience. I miss a lot of aspects of it, but I'm glad to be more mature than I was back then.
Amen to that for me as well. Nathan, what about you?
Yeah, so I guess Dickens put it well: "It's the best of times, the worst of times."
So you were kind of the nerdy kid then. You were
I guess,
Dickens and quoting him in the corners.
Yeah, actually, I was kind of like Pastor Kent. I went to a small Christian school, but I was new. Mm-hmm. It was very different going in because at a small Christian school, everyone knows everybody. They go to the same church. They grew up together throughout the years in the same grade. So probably the first 6 months or so, it was, where do I fit into all of this? Fortunately for me, at a small Christian school, sports was my in. Mm-hmm. So I played sports and quickly found friends through that. And I'd say overall, my high school experience, sports was for me the best thing about being in school. But in some sense, it was also really challenging being at a Christian school. I'll probably allude to this later. I wasn't saved. Mm-hmm. So I had no interest in spiritual things. So every time a rule was presented to me at this Christian school, I was bucking, the system and, clashing with teachers and with the school administration. And then, of course, that comes into my parents getting involved. So I loved it for the sports avenue that it allowed me to participate in, because as Pastor Kent said, that was the idol of my life in high school. I did not like the spiritual stuff about it. But now looking back, I can really appreciate some of the things I did learn that I did not know that I was learning at that time. So that's my experience mostly with high school.
Okay. All right. Joshua.
So I just learned that, Matt, you're 6 years older than me, because your last year at LCA was my first year at LCA.
Wow.
And when
I was the torch.
I did. Well, as a sixth grader, there wasn't much of a torch for me to pick up. But my first 3 years of going to school at LCA were actually really great. I really enjoyed middle school, which is not the normative experience I've come to find. I think for the rest of my life, I will be continually on the search for the Joshua from sixth grade. And if I can somehow get back to him, I'll be very happy to have found him again. I just had a great middle school experience. I had good friends and things were great. I had a lot of fun. Once high school hit, though, I really did not have a good time. Similarly to Matt, just was really had a bout with depression, and my friend group really, it seems like we all had a really hard time together. There was just some really dark things, including things like my friends struggling with self-harm, a lot of sexual sin among my friend group, and just really trying to find ourselves and comforting each other, because we were at a Christian school, comforting each other with platitudes of, Bible verses but not really seeking help from anyone older than us. And we thought that we could, self-medicate with scripture. And that's just another really strange phenomenon of growing up in a very, very churched atmosphere in a Christian school. So I did find everything kind of come to a head my end of sophomore, beginning of junior year. And so the second half of my junior year and then my senior year were very redemptive times for me. A lot of chapters in that book had closed, and then some new ones opened up by the grace of God my senior year. So that was really cool. And then the rest of my life kind of the trajectory of it really shifted my senior year. And so when I look back at middle school and high school, very much a mixed bag.
Yeah. Well, I will continue the trend, and that is that mixed bag, because I think that for myself, it was very similar, only reversed. Middle school was indeed the worst time on the face of the planet for me. And I dealt with then a lot of the suicidal thoughts, depression, because there was that comparison game I was making, and it just was a messy time. I ended up in in-school suspensions and detentions, and I was at a Christian school at the time. But high school, I kind of continued that for a little bit until I came to know the Lord, and then the trajectory did change. And it really was, the Lord was very faithful and gracious in that. And so what I hear, and that I hope is an encouragement to those who are listening, is that if you're hearing these stories and you're going, oh yeah, that was, I kind of walked through those same waters. Oh yeah, that's the experience of wrestling during these years is normative. It is a normal thing to wrestle with, who in the world am I?
Yep.
Where does God fit into this? Not just the platitude God, as you were saying there, Joshua, but the deep, abiding love of Christ. Where is that in my life? How am I pursuing that? So these are the kind of things that I think, of course, now being older, we can look back and say, oh yeah, I wish I had known that then. I wish I had known that at that time. So as I think about this and this turmoil, what were some of the biggest wrestlings that were happening in your school at the time? Cultural, social. I know nowadays it's kind of, we see LGBT movement in schools. We're dealing with just high social pressure with social media, with just media in general being so prevalent. Back in my day, there we go. If I wanted to watch something, I had to go to that big old box TV, with the clicker that was like a mile long, and turn it on and then find the right station. And then my parents would find me and say, go outside. And so that was basically how
Mike,
that worked.
Can you define what a clicker is for our young listeners out there?
A remote control. I'm sorry. We'll use that terminology. So it just wasn't like a thin Apple remote. It was the size of a giant brick.
Back in Kent's day, he had to actually get up and turn the knob.
I know you're making a joke, but that's true. Anyway.
So what kind of things did you find yourself wrestling with, maybe in the social pressures and the cultural norms of that time? And maybe how did you deal with that?
The longer I live, the more I see cyclical things.
Yeah.
Sin just shows itself in different forms at any stage going through. So what did I deal with? I graduated high school in '89. So we're talking late '80s. It was the pressure for partying, alcohol, the pressure of recreational drug use, certainly sexual immorality. It was just selfish.
Yeah.
So hedonism, if you want to put it that way, pleasure of self. So does that's still here. It just manifests maybe a little different. Yeah. And some of those things are the same. But some things are very, 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 very different. Yeah. I think there's more things that are more culturally accepted now, certainly this 30 years later, than what was culturally accepted, or I would even say a norm back when, certainly when I was back in the day. I guess that's a phrase, sorry. But I do see just, if I had to, what did I struggle with culturally? It's almost like giving into the culture and selfishly living for me. So however that plays that out, that's going to be quite literally, I think, a lot of the same temptation for children and teens today. So whatever the cultural pressure is, how do you interact with it, and how do you stand against it, or how do you live in the midst of it? Yeah. And as I shared earlier, I didn't stand. I stood for certain things. It was very funny. Yeah. I stood for almost the legalistic type of things. Yep. So I called myself Christian. I didn't swear. I didn't drink. Right. Yeah. I didn't drink alcohol. I had to keep the appearance of a goody-goody for the most part, but I was unbelievably selfish, deceptive. Relationships not good.
Yeah.
Things like that were more of the hidden type of stuff. So, but it goes to I gave into the culture because I chose to live for me instead of living for the Lord.
And I think that culture of self, a lot of it boils down to that, I think, in many ways. The pressure that's placed on that maybe takes a little bit different views like in my day, it was the pressure to have the girlfriend, right? That was kind of like the big thing. I never was able to get one, and so it was really very difficult. And so, that caused a lot of tension and anxiety in my life, because it was like, well, this is the norm, is I'm supposed to be popular and have a girlfriend, and I can't achieve either one of these. And so therefore I'm failing as a person. Now I think we have the added element of things like, well, not only do you have to have the girlfriend or the boyfriend and be popular in school, you need to be popular online. You have to be able to have engagement there in order to, whatever it is. But any other thoughts, guys?
Yeah, I don't remember. I was, trying to think through what was going on societally. I was in high school, 2005, 2008, that window. So right before social media really took off. So that wasn't a big thing for me. But I don't know societally anything that I particularly remember, but I can remember being a part of a Christian school in North Carolina and Bible Belt, really struggling with going to school and being frustrated with those who called themselves Christians. And mind you, I'm not a Christian at this time. But I'm looking at those who profess to be Christ followers and yet are doing the same things that I'm doing. The interesting thing about it is, I'm frustrated. The term hypocrite comes to mind. So I'm frustrated at them, and I'm wrestling with, well, if that's what Jesus following looks like, well, then why should I change? Like, why? Yeah. What's the appeal? Yeah. But the interesting thing about it is, as I looked at my life, in preparation for this and looking back, I would have characterized myself as, I wouldn't have done it then, but I would now, as a hypocrite too. Because if I got around the right kind of people, I would act like the Christian. Yeah. I'd act, I'd put on the appearance of. Yep. But if I got around the wrong kinds of people or in the wrong setting where we didn't have to put up appearances, I'd be right there doing the things that they were doing, saying the words that they'd be saying, having the coarse conversations that they'd be having. So I was not so much, it was very easy for me to pick apart who's a hypocrite around me. Yeah. And not realize that I was also a hypocrite at that time. So I don't know societally what was going on that I was wrestling with, but I was really struggling with who is God. And when I come here to this school, there are so many people who profess to be a follower of him, of Jesus, and they look just like me. So I really, that to me was a huge turnoff for quite a few years.
And that's a challenging thing. And maybe even maybe there's students who are listening, that is something to consider. Does your life reflect Christ both at church when you're around the Christians that you're trying to, look like, as well as around those who do not confess Christ? Because there is, and there can be, a detrimental effect to those lives who see that hypocrisy. It's one thing to struggle. It's another to kind of have that mask, Now, speaking of kind of the spiritual life, what was your spiritual life like in high school? Like, what part does church play in this? Are you spending time in God's Word on a regular basis? Nathan, I know you mentioned that you didn't know Christ until the end of your high school.
We went to church. Yeah. That was, my parents, solid believers, following Jesus as long as I've been around them. So we went to church, and I went to comply. I don't think until my senior year of high school, unless it was in Bible class at school, that of my own volition, I cannot recall a time I opened the Bible just to read it for myself until the night that I got saved. Wow. So that's
awesome.
kind of my spiritual. It was non-existent.
And that demonstrates just how awesome our God is, right? That he is able to, even though you hadn't been doing those things or whatnot, you had kind of pushed them to the side, that he was able to intervene and bring you to himself in that. So what about you guys, Matt?
Well, I'm going to answer the last question.
Yes, please do.
This one,
Please do.
because I was formulating my thoughts, and I was like, no, wait, I have an answer. And I don't know if this is a part of it. I feel like it was, but we might not have talked about it. When I was in 8th grade, 9/11 happened.
Mm.
So we had this kind of dark cloud over us. We were always at war, it felt like. And, that's when I felt like in my life you heard more about politics and they started ramping up and, what they were doing. So going through there, I don't know, maybe we just had this cloud over us in that high school experience and what our culturally we were dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of what Josh alluded to, in his time there was a lot of self-harm. And I remember we were dealing with depression. I was dealing with depression. Some of my friends were dealing with depression. And a lot of people would confide in me if they were having suicidal thoughts, if they were cutting themselves. And of course, that just carrying your friend's weight was just as soul-crushing because that's what I was trying to do, trying to be a good Christian.
Yeah.
Because I would say my identity, if you will, was that I was the kid from Heritage because then the only people there really were from Thomas Road. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying when I got there, I remember the youth pastor actually came to me. He's like, how come you don't come to church? I have you on my roster. They just took the school roster and he wondered why I didn't show. I was like, I go to church like every week. So for like my Christian faith, my identity was I went to Heritage. Everything I did was here at the church. I was less about school, more about my church youth group, and so bringing that to school, it kind of made me weird because I was the one who wasn't going to church with them. So I was missing out on the youth activities because everyone went to the same youth group and I went to Heritage. And I love that group, but they're still high schoolers. So I'm getting my friends at school are hurting. My friends at church are hurting. But I love the youth group. I love being there. I would volunteer to set up the rooms because I just wanted to be there and getting involved in literally anything I could get my hands on in youth group. I love being Christian. I love my faith, and I would bring it. I read my Bible all the time, and I refer to Josh. Your testimony was really funny because I was like, that's me. Yeah. If I could find the version of myself that I thought was the best is 9th grade me. Wow. 9th grade me was always in his Bible, always doing stuff, was very disciplined, ran cross country. So I had that discipline ingrained in me. You ran 10 miles a day, then you went home to church, homework, read your Bible, went to bed after playing video games for 10 hours, sleeping very little. But so my faith was pretty strong. Yeah. And I as much as it needed maturity, I wasn't fake. Yeah. But because of the Christian faith, I had this heart for people. But because everyone was hurting, I just made my emotional well-being less because I was just taking on everyone's burdens.
So how did you deal with that ultimately? I mean, because that is a heavy burden to carry as a high schooler, as someone who's got his own stuff and you're dealing with, and we all deal with this to some extent. But how did you at that time deal with it, or were you able to process kind of that stuff?
So one of my main issues that I guess I had to work on just as I matured through college, because I really didn't get out of my deep state of depression until sometime in college, was I think a lot of kids deal with this, and there's just a way to put it in words. I had a lot of deep thoughts. I thought about a lot of big concepts, but I didn't have the emotional maturity to handle what I was thinking. Yeah. And so I would just spiral with whatever I had because I couldn't reel it all in, couldn't process it. I could think about it. I could understand it, but emotionally I couldn't. And it just spins you out of control. But it wasn't until, and this is going to sound really cliche, and I hate cliches. I hate saying stuff like that. But I eventually in college, and after some time at some Word of Life camps or whatever, I found my identity in Christ. I knew what He wanted me to do, why I was here, in our relationship. And once that was kind of settled, I didn't feel the burden of my friends because I knew who I could give them to. I knew that ultimately wasn't my responsibility. I just had to be there, but that was the only way I got through it. And it sounds like such a church answer, but that's what happened. I knew
it's true though.
I want to work with youth kids.
Yeah,
that's what God has me to do. That's what I do. I find complete satisfaction in it wherever I am, and I can help kids, and I don't have to. Yeah, sometimes you feel sad if you can't help them, but it doesn't crush me anymore because I can talk to God about it.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Matt, you were. It's very strange. You were articulating my high school experience word for word. I was the same guy, just the one who people would come to confess their sins, and it was a crushing weight. I think, especially when you get into territory of suicide and self-harm, it is such a feeling of shame comes over the person who is feeling that way. And I think it's Satan's attempt to keep them in this cycle because they hide it and are so ashamed of it that they can't reach out to the people who can actually help them. Yeah. So I became that person who everyone would come to when they had cut the night before. And I would just have to bear that just for years. This was my identity in school. And because these were top secret things that they were sharing, I ended up keeping so much from my parents because they would say, don't tell anybody. And the biggest fear was being found out. And so I didn't share this with a soul outside of my friend group. And that ended up creating a cycle for me where I just wouldn't share anything with my parents. I would stiff arm my parents, keep them away. And it wasn't until things actually exploded for me around the beginning of 11th grade. And all of these secrets came out, all of these things that I had been hiding, that my friends had been hiding, it all got found out by the school, by my parents. And we actually ended up coming to Heritage around that time. And it was the confluence of those two things, of all of these secrets, these deep, dark secrets, sin being exposed, and then being placed in the Heritage Youth Group, where I was sitting every Wednesday night around a table with two older guys who were college students who were able to look me in the eye and say, this is not everything. Like, life goes on beyond high school. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to go to college. I'm going to move away. There is life post high school. Yeah. I had never thought about that before. Yeah. And it really was just that shedding light on the things that I was going through, and then pointing me to the future, that there is hope down the road after graduation. And then my senior year was awesome. Yeah.
Wow.
Amen. It does bring up a good point, Mike, if I could just.
Yeah, please do.
One of the dangers that I see, that I even think social media, as my kids went through and started texting and started having the phone, it does, and now social media even that much more, it exposes young people at an even younger age to burdens that they're carrying for the behalf of their friends. And Matt and Joshua shared this. And I look at, I even think myself, back in the day, it was one of those things, I tried to be kind. I tried to listen to people. So when you are like that, when you try to demonstrate really what is some Christian characters of kindness or being compassionate for people, they tell you stuff because a lot of times they don't have other avenues. And what you find is so much of the time is, well, I am not prepared to handle this. Yeah. So if we're talking about a back to school issue here, kind of, I would say, parents, this just reiterates to me so much of the investment and involvement that you have to be in your kids' lives. And I mean, like, intentionally, I'll use the word prying into their life. I mean, intentionally trying to, in a wisdom type of way, force yourself into their life of being there, sharing things with them, hearing them without judgment, trying to interact with them. And you know what? Sometimes they still won't share or open up. But I absolutely believe the majority of young people are walking around carrying burdens that others have put on them that they don't know how to deal with. And it is like an anchor that they're dragging around. And they need that older, wiser somebody to talk to know that. So that's just one of the things that deeply concerns me with our young people today, and especially with the social media, how much more access is somebody behind a keyboard even dumping more stuff on them that they're receiving, and then they have no idea how to do anything with it except carry it as a burden.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that gets to thank you for sharing that, Ken. I think that's so important that parents be prepared, and not just prepared, but intentional in having those conversations with their kids. And on the same point, if you're a student and you're listening to this, find mature, godly people who are older than you, who you can share with, to process, to help you work through these things, whether it's your parents, whether it's a youth leader, whether it's somebody who has a walk with Christ, who can help you process through these things. It is so important. I look back on my life and during middle school and early high school, during those times of tension, if I had simply gone to my parents or somebody else and just begun talking about, hey, this is what's going through my mind. Like you're saying, Matt, there's all these thoughts going through my head and they're all so heavy. I don't know what to do with them and I don't know how to process them. That's why God gave us one another. You know, that's why he gave us a church. That's why he gave us parents. That's why he gave us the family. And so don't be scared about sharing. God desires to help you with those things, but often he will use his people to do that. And so often we think, oh, I got this. I got to do this. I just got to persevere. And that builds anxiety. It builds depression. It makes you more lonely because you just kind of fall back into that deep pit of despair. And God's got greater things for you than that. So if I can encourage anyone out there who's maybe dealing with that, I think that's...
And it's a lie of Satan that we have to deal with it by ourselves.
Yes.
Or that we have to be the one to solve that issue.
Yes.
It really is.
I think, you know, when you kind of mentioned about regrets, I think in regrets, and I can go through a plethora of them, but I think that's one of them in high school, middle school, very, very much so, is just I wish I had been more honest with my parents first, and then with my maybe just some people in my youth group or whatnot, because I think it would have really guarded me against a lot of the pain that I endured. So let's take kind of that conversation and let's steer into the whole idea of dealing with parents. What was your relationship like with your parents during these years? Middle school, high school, good, bad, ugly? I know some parents may listen to this podcast, so you know.
I had very supportive parents.
Yeah,
there wasn't a ball game or there wasn't anything that I was involved in that they didn't travel to see or participate in. Knew they loved me, and the people pleaser self that I am, I did a lot of stuff to try not to disappoint them, because I know some of the stuff that I was doing would have disappointed them. So unfortunately, my relationship was, as Joshua mentioned, I kind of kept them at a distance for fear of disappointing them. But I knew they loved me. But it was just I was living for myself, and I knew, again, the disappointment that would cause. So although I would say had a good relationship with my parents, I put up a wall between us during those years. That's one of those regrets.
Yeah. Anyone else?
One of the questions that we were asked to potentially prepare for was regrets in high school, and that maybe one of the top 2 or 3 regrets that I can walk away from high school experience with was how I treated my parents. As Pastor Ken said, incredibly supportive parents who never missed a game. And I played a lot of sports, so that was a deep commitment to be involved in my life, who loved the Lord, who were pouring into me. And I, again, wanted nothing to do with God, and by extension, nothing to do with what they were telling me or trying to teach me or trying to model for me. Especially my mom. There's aspects of, even now, things I look back on and I wish I had done things differently, said things differently to her. I knew what to say that would push her buttons. I knew what to say that would cut her to deep within her heart. I mean, by the time I got to my sophomore year, I was struggling with, idolizing basketball, and by extension, idolizing what basketball brought me or what I thought it brought me, specific dating relationships that I was involved in that I shouldn't have been involved in, eventually letting my life go to the point of, in an eating disorder for 6 years of my life, extending into college, and butting heads with my mom all the time. It was very strained. I mean, maybe that's the best word to summarize all that. Very strained. I knew they loved me. I'm thankful that they never gave up on me. I love how committed they were to me, and I can appreciate it now, but I hated it then because it felt like they were always in my business. Just leave me alone. Let me live the life that I want to live, even though my life was, I mean, it was destructive. Yeah. It was destroying me and those around me. But it was not a good scene in our home for about 4 years of high school life.
Wow. Anyone else?
Mom, you're awesome. Not only she might listen to this, she could probably hear us because she's down the hall. I had a good relationship with my parents. They were very supportive, making sure that I was able to get to the things I need to get to, let me be involved in a bunch of stuff. But they're also a little hands off. And sometimes I ask my mom about that, and she's like, well, I feel like I didn't really have to worry about you because I had this really overactive conscience. So they lucked out on that because if I told my mom, I was like, hey, I'm going to leave Trevor's house and then we're going to go to the movies and we stopped at McDonald's, I'd feel guilty. I'd be like, I didn't tell my mom we're stopping at McDonald's. I got to text. Someone have a phone. I got to tell my mom we went to McDonald's too. So they didn't feel like they had to worry too much, but I do feel like, I think sometimes that maybe they, kind of just let me go and hope for the best. Yeah. But I knew they were always there. So
that's good.
I'd say the same for, excuse me, for my parents. I always knew that they loved me and were so supportive of me. And I just like Pastor Kent, what you were saying, I stiff-armed them and I kept them at a distance because I didn't want them to know the things that were really weighing me down. And so if you take the secrecy, I guess, and then you combine it with this nasty little Bible culture cocktail, it really influenced the way that my parents were leading my family, my brothers and me, and sisters and me spiritually. I remember specifically when way back when Life Action came to Heritage, I put up such a fuss to my parents because I did not want to go and be confronted with spiritual realities about myself because it meant that I was going to have to fake it and that would just trouble me, or I would have to just come out with all of this information. And so I ended up stiff-arming them, and I even said some hurtful things to my parents in that time about their spiritual leadership, saying things like, I just hate it when we pray together as a family. And I'm just thinking about that now, as a mom, to hear your son say, I hate it when we pray together, that's gotta hurt. And I think that the Lord really used the people at Heritage to kind of pull me, I guess, away from my parents in a spiritual leadership state because I really needed that, but I was not in a state to allow my parents to lead me spiritually in that time. And it's because of sin. It's all because of sin. But God is still so good that he provided older people for me to lead me for those 2.5 years, I'd say. And then now I'm able to go every time I go to my parents' house, my mom's like, oh, I've got a question about Ephesians that I wanted to talk with you about. We've got these great conversations about what the Lord is doing in our lives. But in that little tiny season, it just wasn't possible. I don't know.
Yeah.
So maybe in hearing those 4 quick testimonies, I could say I'm speaking to you parents. Endure.
Yes.
Hang on.
Yeah.
If you're instilling godly principles and you're living the godly life as you should, there will be seasons where your kids will actually maybe even tell you that they hate you.
Yep.
And hang on. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep praying to the Lord. And Lord willing, you will have these wonderful conversations with your children. It might not be a month later. It might be a decade later, but hang on and endure. And then in season, they will grow to appreciate what you are doing and what you're trying to do.
is that a warning? I know Nathan and I here have young kids. Are they gonna hate me one day?
Possibly.
Is that
there is
they will hate some of the decisions you make. Yes.
I remember because for me there was that, and as I mentioned, like middle school was just like chaos in my heart towards my parents, to the point like my dad would get in the car and he'd put in a Sandy Patty tape, right? Let's go old school here, and I would literally cover the speakers with my hand and my leg, and I would like, I don't want to hear this, and just because I didn't. That what kind of to your point, it's like I didn't want to hear this, Dad. I don't want to hear this. I don't whatever. And I vividly remember that, and that was kind of probably one of the hardest times of my life because I was just wrestling with who God is. I was a hypocrite. I had prayed a prayer, but it wasn't a true salvific experience. It was just to please my parents, and so I was wrestling with God and all this kind of stuff, and even into high school. Just that disappointment for, that it was mainly my dad. My mom was my counselor and I was okay going to her and all that kind of stuff. But my dad, for whatever reason, we just were at each other's throats. And I remember specifically one time I didn't do well in school. I'll just say that. And so I think it was sophomore year and I had made a couple D's or something like that. And my dad is in the kitchen and he's chopping up vegetables for dinner. And I could just hear the knife get a little bit more rhythmic and a little bit more intense. And his words to me were, "You're going to work at McDonald's the rest of your life." And that was that was kind of that.
Not that there's anything wrong with
Not that there's anything wrong with it, but it was just kind of like that. You are never going to go anywhere because you are just so stubborn and you're just being passive about school and about life and about all this kind of stuff. And so there was just that tension. But by the grace of God, when the Lord transformed my life in junior high, as a junior in high school, there was a complete 180 with my relationship with my parents, with my brother, with the tension in the household disappeared to a large extent because God was so gracious in that. And now my dad is one of my best friends. Great counselor. He and my mom are just a true blessing to my family and have been for years and years. And so, to your point, Ken, parents, endure. Seek the Lord, seek counsel, read his words, continue to take your kids into prayer, even when they go kicking and screaming, because that steady demonstration of a faithful life in Christ will be fruitful in time. And I think a lot of times we get frustrated with that as parents, but it's true. God is faithful in that. So just continue.
Yeah, you mentioned the endurance aspect of parenting. I got saved the end of my senior year of high school in April, and all the things. It's interesting for parents listening. Even if you don't think they are, your kids are listening.
Yes.
They are listening to what you are saying. They're certainly watching how you're living.
Yes.
And I hated all the spiritual principles that my parents were talking about and trying to model in front of me. I hated everything about God and Christianity until my senior year of high school when I got saved. And then it was interesting. It was like every Awana verse that I had ever heard, every Word of Life verse in youth group that I had ever heard, all these principles that my parents had been living out or trying to speak into my life. Now I loved those things, and I remembered what they taught me. And so it was like the Word of God it became alive to me.
Yes.
So for parents listening, like, yes, endure, but talking about like the fruitfulness of when your kid, by the grace of God, is saved. All those things that you have been banging your head against the wall, just praying and praying for your kid to get it, and they do get it. It's worth it. And now, like as you said, my relationship with my parents is one of I go to them for counsel. They are close friends and give me a lot of godly wisdom, as they always did. But now I am wanting to receive that.
Yeah,
it's good. Well, guys, we're going to wrap up here in a second, but I wanted to throw out the question: what do you miss from your school days back in the day, if you will? Are there elements of your time in school that you miss now as a responsible adult.
Yeah, that's probably it. I mean, for me,
I was going to say.
for me, that's I miss in some ways the simplicity of life. I could just go to school, sit in class, go home, do homework, play sports.
Yeah.
It was a little easier.
Yeah.
A little easier then.
Yeah.
I miss that.
I do miss being able to like come home and then, Matt, you'll appreciate this, is just sit down and like play Final Fantasy VII for like 8 hours straight, and just be like, I don't have no responsibilities, right? It's just until my parents are like, oh, what are you doing? Get outside. So yeah, those kind of things were always.
And then you carried
nice.
your Game Boy
and then
outside.
Yeah, I never got a Game Boy. I never got one. My parents wouldn't let me. It was very sad.
No wonder middle school was bad for you, Mike. No, I'm just kidding. If I miss one thing, I mean, I'm getting old enough now. I miss being able to do the activities that I used to do in sports and played 3 seasons of sports and would wake up the next day like nothing happened the day before.
Yeah.
And now I can injure myself sleeping.
Yeah.
So
that is true. That is true.
When I was in 8th grade, one of my friends at lunch, she had a frozen meal, and in the frozen meal was a piece of green meat. It was just meat that had turned green. And I took it and I folded it up in a napkin and I kept it in my pocket and I named it King Edward. And I would just show it to everybody at school, and I would eat salt packets, and I'd just carry around mayonnaise. I would just do really weird stuff. And it would just for fun, just to make
you would be a
myself
YouTube
laugh.
sensation at this point with that of content.
Well, I had a camera. I would videotape
That's
myself
when
doing everything.
Adults would ask you like, "What were you thinking?" You're like, "I wasn't.
I wasn't. I was just being myself, and whatever I would tickle me, I would just do it. And I really wish I had. I don't wish for a lack of self-awareness, but a little bit, maybe.
Now, I see you are really the man for the job in children's ministry. I just got to say that.
Yeah, I would say the one thing that I miss is kind of being on a team. Like I love being on running cross country, even though it's not specifically a team sport because you are trying to do your best individually. But the idea that I would go to practice with this group and we always had each other's back. Even when I switched over to acting my senior year, you had the cast and we had this camaraderie and this fellowship, and we always did things together as a team. And I think as an adult, I've secretly always been looking for that, finding a job where I'm like, are we in this together, or are you just out to undercut me? And we're not really building a team. So I love working with these guys here in youth group. We're a team. Clearly know who's the boss. The youth pastors, but the idea of like, we have this task to share the Christ with these kids, and we're going to do it together. And that's so. Looking back in high school, I don't know. I feel like sometimes like I really miss being on a team. That's cool.
I think to that end, Matt, and is the ease of relationships back then. At the time, it didn't seem that way. At the time, it did not seem that way. But there were a bunch of friends. I had a bunch of friends, and we were always doing things together. And there was a dynamic in that, and maybe it was the simplicity of life, right? I didn't have all these other responsibilities, so I had time to really invest in friends and spend time together with friends. And I think as you get older, I have found it's much harder to make those friends, especially those friends that you're sitting around sharing things with, those deeper things, and having those conversations. And so maybe there is an aspect of that, kind of the team, and even for me, the friend, kind of that making the friends and just doing all sorts of fun stuff together.
I would like to put an emphasis. I miss the team. I don't miss running 10 miles a day, though I wish I could.
Well, guys, thank you so much for coming in and kind of sharing kind of your own experience and what the Lord's done. Any final words before we kind of close out? Any thoughts as kids are heading into school and even as parents are dealing with kids heading into maybe a new phase of life or new school year? Any final thoughts?
I guess for the students listening, maybe this is my youth pastor heart coming out. Just a reminder, what I've told them many times, God has you in the family that you're in the school that you're in the setting that you're in for a reason. Don't miss Don't be like I think a lot of us and say we missed opportunity. That we wish that if we could go back to do it again, we would. Take advantage of the day that you have wherever God places you. He has you there for a reason. Be faithful, be in the Word, surround yourself with godly counsel and older individuals who can pour into you, and be bold. Amen. And in a good way. Don't care what people think about you to the point that it stymies your walk with Jesus. Yeah. So that's my pastoral heart as these teens are preparing to go back to school in a little bit. Awesome.
Well, I think that's a great way to end. Great word there, Nathan. Thank you so much, guys. Again, thank you so much for joining me. This has been just a great joy. Great joy.
Thank you.
Well, this has been another episode of the Alongside Podcast. For more details on Alongside, visit alongsidepodcast.com. Also, wherever you may be listening, make sure to leave a 5-star review so others can hear about Alongside and be encouraged in their faith. I'm your host, Mike Crump. Thanks for listening, and we hope that you'll join us next time as we continue to come alongside other followers of Christ in order to have thoughtful conversations about the gospel, culture, and the church.